David Gottler looked at his partner Kazuya Harade as they stood on the northwest face of Ama Dablam, an incredibly difficult and technical mountain in the Himalayas. Harade had snow all over his face and looked exhausted. The pair had just slid 10 meters down the steep slope after they were covered by an avalanche. They were lucky they were still alive, mainly thanks to their climbing ropes wrapped tightly around their waists. They were attempting to climb a brand new variation of a difficult route up the northwest face, but the snow conditions above 6,450 meters were making the climb impossible. They had minimal gear on their backs, as they were climbing alpine style, which means they were climbing with as little gear as possible, as they chose speed over long-term survival. It is the purest form of mountaineering. Both David and Kazuya looked at each other, accepting that they wouldn't be summiting the peak. But as they started to descend, they encountered large seracs and cliff faces. The problem was the pair did not have the correct gear to descend. They could no longer retreat or advance. They were trapped. Their only hope was a Nepalese legend, helicopter pilot Sabin Basnyat. This is his story. After David and Kazuya realized their mistake and the reality of their situation began to set in, they would stop to rest on a small col on the ridge. There was just enough space to set up a bivouac, and that is where they would both rest, pull out their satellite phone, and ring their agent in Kathmandu requesting a helicopter rescue. They were told that a rescue would be attempted, but because of the weather and time of day, it would have to wait until the following morning. The duo began to feel uneasy as the sun fell behind the ridge and darkness shrouded them. The winds would begin to pick up, and this worried both David and Kazuya, because they both knew that if the weather continued to be difficult, it would be nearly impossible for any rescue to take place. Luckily, the wind dropped the next morning, meaning a rescue would be possible. There was a large serac or giant block of ice below them that was large enough for a helicopter to land. They knew that this would be the area they needed to climb to. Kazuya would fix a rope to the top of the lower serac using a snow stake before climbing onto the ice. While both climbers were exhausted, they had exceptional experience in the mountains. Both of them had been climbing for years and knew they had to remain calm in this situation, so they waited on the large serac with a lump in their throats. Early morning on November 7, 2010, Sabin Basnyat was going through his pre-flight routine from a small airport in Lukla, Nepal. His flying partner and technician, Purnal Wale, sat next to him. It was a good morning to fly. There were light winds and clear skies, and as Sabin took off from the small airport, he began to feel calm. He had been dispatched to rescue two climbers stranded above 6,000 meters on Ama Dablam, a mountain that was less than 16 kilometers away from Everest. Sabin's literal job was life and death. He was a pilot and co-owner of Fishtail Air, a private aviation company created specifically for Himalayan mountaineer rescues. He had over 6,000 flight hours and was considered one of the greatest pilots the region had ever seen. He was a part of the highest ever rescue mission in spring of 2010 when he piloted his chopper to 21,000 feet on Annapurna's Camp 2, saving the lives of 3 sick Spanish climbers. By 9 a.m., Sabin was piloting his aircraft slowly towards the north face of Ama Dablam. Anything above 6,000 meters is considered a high-altitude flight, but this was a normal day for Sabin. Even still, he flew slow and steady, as the major danger was the thin air. The higher he flew, the thinner the air became, which makes the rotors of the craft less efficient, and eventually they wouldn't be able to generate enough lift. And then, well, he wasn't going to reach that altitude. Sabin and his partner also had oxygen masks over their faces, as it was easy for the thin air to make him lightheaded if he did not receive enough oxygen, and that was a recipe for disaster. While David and Kazuya waited on the large serac, they saw the faint black dot on the skyline that approached them from the east. It got closer and closer, and they both released a sigh of relief as they realized it was a rescue helicopter. As Sabin got closer to the ridge, David and Kazuya watched as he inched the helicopter towards the serac. Because of the thin air, the aircraft moved back and forth, a sign of the difficulty of flying in the high altitude, but Sabin would land the chopper on the ice after a few minutes of battle. Because of the altitude, Sabin could only fly one climber off the peak at a time, so David and Kazuya would turn towards each other, share a few words, then put up their hands in front of their bodies, facing each other. They would decide who would get off the peak first, just like any normal adult, with a game of rock, paper, scissors. David would eventually win, and it was decided Kazuya would stay on the slope, but would keep all the supplies with him. Hopefully, it would only be for an hour or so, but you just never know. David would climb up and into the helicopter before giving his climbing partner one more glance as Sabin maneuvered the aircraft off the mountain and back into a safe altitude, eventually being dropped off in a nearby village. From the village, David would watch as he could see the entire north face of Ama Dablam. He couldn't help but pull his phone out of his pocket and begin filming, thinking he could share the video with his friend later, both having a good laugh of relief. Soon the helicopter was approaching from the east and hovering above Kazuya. The gap from the Serac to the aircraft was roughly 30 centimeters, but as Kazuya looked on, he couldn't help but have an uneasy feeling in his stomach. Instincts told him that it was too dangerous to get on board, and his delay may have just saved his life. Kazuya would hear a loud bang and then a roar, and instantly watch as the chopper began losing altitude in front of him. He was stunned and could only watch as black smoke billowed out. He smelt the overwhelming scent of oil, and to his horror, the helicopter fell down the face of the mountain. Miraculously, Kazuya would be unscathed. Small piles of fallen snow were the only remnants of the chopper that was flying a few meters away from him seconds earlier. Kazuya didn't know it at the time, but Sabin, in his attempt to rescue Kazuya, had flown too close to the ridge, and his main rotor had struck the side of the mountain, instantly disintegrating the metal blades and sending the helicopter into a free fall for over 5,000 feet before crashing into the side of the mountain, instantly killing Sabin and his partner Purna. But Kazuya's story was not over. He was still stranded on the side of Ama Dablam, and his chance of rescue was now gone. His only option was to repitch his tent and wait, hoping that there would be another rescue. As the sun fell, it was difficult for him to sleep, but eventually he would start to fade in and out of consciousness. The next day at 7 a.m., Kazuya, wide awake, began to hear another helicopter engine approaching. As it got closer, it hovered just a few meters away, but Kazuya, waving his hands around, signaled the Serac was not a safe place to land. The pilot would fly several circles around the area before signaling a flat area nearly 50 meters below Kazuya. He instantly understood. Exhausted, but pumping with adrenaline, Kazuya would grab a nearby rope and begin descending the peak with his gear. About 15 minutes later, he would reach the flat area, where he would climb into the helicopter and off the mountain. Helicopter accidents have unfortunately become a common occurrence in the Himalayas. Even in 2023, 6 lives were lost due to their chopper losing control on its way to Everest, and there are countless stories of more accidents throughout the last decade. Some chalk it up to pushing yourself beyond your means, knowing someone can bail you out, but it comes at a cost, with rescues operating at $2,500 American dollars per hour. There is no mistaking that with many inexperienced climbers on the mountains, there are increasing scenarios where an air rescue is necessary. After the incidents, David and Kazuya would both continue climbing, with David going on to accomplish many difficult summits and eventually reaching the pinnacle of Everest with no supplementary oxygen in 2022. Many times we speak about the dangers of the mountains and those that climb them, but we must also recognize and acknowledge the dangers others put themselves in to save those in their darkest hours.